Let's have small kirtan first. Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihare Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihare Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivaradhare Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivaradhare Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatiravanachari Yamunatiravanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhare Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhare Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatiravanachari Yamunatiravanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Narayanam Namaskrityam Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jaya Mudhirayet Nashtaprayeshu Vabhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki Krishnaya Vasudevaya Devaki Nandanaya Cha Nandagopa Kumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanusute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradhayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tushe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya eva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So the topic of discussion today will be the 15th chapter, verses 6 through to 21. Now in this section, we have just experienced a number of events that appear at the closing of Mahabharata. Of course, Bhishma has passed away. Then Parikshit was born. Dhritarashtra retires by Vidra's mercy and guidance. And um, now, of course, Krishna himself has just left the world. We know that the Lord had appeared in order to fulfill a particular mission. And all the personalities, all of Krishna's associates who had appeared with the Lord, they came to act as instruments to help the Lord fulfill his mission. Now, many of the Lord's intimate associates were leaving. Like what we see here is the conclusion of the Yadu dynasty, the completion of Krishna's pastimes. And chapter 15 describes the Pandavas' reaction to Krishna's disappearance. Particularly in the verses that we're going to discuss here, it is Arjuna's reaction. Now, the Pandavas had been waiting for a sign ever since Dhritarashtra left, because at that time, Narada came to them and he intimated to them that they should keep a watch for when Krishna would himself leave. And upon receiving a hint that Krishna is going to leave, their natural instincts would, of course, be to wind up their pastimes, because they had no reason to stay if Krishna was not staying. So they'd just been waiting for a hint of when Krishna wanted them to leave. Actually, the life of the Pandavas is such, because they were instruments of Krishna's grace in this world, their entire life they were waiting, or they were guided by the Lord or by the Lord's agents in terms of how they should react or how they should respond to particular situations. So at the time that Dhritarashtra passed away, Narada, as Lord's associate, gave them that indication that that it is likely Krishna will leave soon also. So you, Pandavas, as Krishna's servants, you can prepare yourself for that time. Now, the first thing that started happening were certain omens that were not right. And of course, Yudhishthira Maharaj had noticed them. When Arjuna came back devoid of bodily luster, full of grief, and he was on the verge of basically collapsing, he came in front of Yudhishthira. Yudhishthira Maharaj was concerned, and he dreaded to ask the question that he was thinking of in his mind. In fact, in the end of the 14th chapter, he begins to ask a whole series of questions, starting from he first begins to ask after their welfare, and this starts from text 25. So text 24 of the 14th chapter says, seeing Arjuna pale due to heartfelt anxieties, the king, remembering the indications of the sage Narada, questioned him in the midst of friends. Yudhishthira Maharaj was dreading to ask him the actual thing he was thinking of. And because when you are dreading a subject, sometimes you don't ask about it directly. You ask all sorts of indirect questions, hoping that it could be something else. Maybe it's the health of a relative. Maybe there's been a financial loss. Maybe there's been like some mistake in something that you were trying to do. So therefore he asks, were you not able to protect somebody? Was there somebody did you have contact with an undesirable a woman with whom you should not have had contact with? He begins to ask these various questions, and then finally, towards the end of his questions, he asks in text 44 at the end of the 14th chapter, this is the question he was actually dreading to ask. Or is it that you're feeling empty for all time because you might have lost your most intimate friend, Lord Krishna? Hridayena Atma Bandhana, like a friend of the heart, like your soulmate almost. Have you lost your most intimate friend, Lord Krishna? Oh, my brother Arjuna, I can think of no other reason for your becoming so dejected. Shunyo asmi rahito nityam. It's like because you're behaving as if everything is void, everything is devoid of life. Life has no meaning anymore. Now, I cannot think of anything else Manyase te anyata naruk. I cannot think of anything else that would produce this kind of reaction in you. And Prabhupada in that purport says, all inquisitiveness of Maharaj Yudhishthira by the world situation was already conjectured by Maharaj Yudhishthira on the basis of Lord Krishna's disappearance from the vision of the Lord, from the vision of the world. And this was now disclosed to him because of the acute dejection of Arjuna, which could not have been possible otherwise. So even though he was doubtful about it, he was obliged to inquire frankly from Arjuna on the basis of Sri Narada's indication. So the first 5 verses of the 15th chapter, Sutta Goswami begins to speak and describe Arjuna's particular state. Now, the state of Arjuna, it's because the comparison that is given in terms of the relationship between the jiva and the Lord, one comparison is like the body and the soul, that Krishna is like the soul and the jiva is like the body. Without a connection to Krishna, the body is completely without life. The body is active. Similarly, no individual appears to have any life in them, any sense of happiness, any sense of meaning or purpose in the world, if he's especially functioning properly without Krishna's presence. And that was what Arjuna was like. He was like a body without life, without the vibrancy, power, and prowess that he previously described, that he previously manifested. So it is described in text 1 of the 15th chapter. Arjuna, the celebrated friend of Lord Krishna, was grief-stricken. Nana Shankash Padam. There were so many feelings of there were so many doubts that were appearing in his mind as a result of Krishna leaving. Krishna Vishlesha Karshita. When his heart was disturbed, his mind was completely not stably situated. And so therefore it was full of doubts. And text 2, Sutta Goswami describes Arjuna's luster and his what was happening physically to him. Due to grief, Arjuna's mouth and lotus-like heart had dried up. Therefore, his body lost all luster. Now, remembering the Supreme Lord, he could hardly utter a word in reply. With great difficulty, he checked the tears of grief that smeared his eyes. He was very distressed because Krishna was out of his sight, and he increasingly felt affection for him. Remembering Lord Krishna and his wishes, benefactions, intimate familial relations, and his chariot driving, Arjuna, overwhelmed and breathing very heavily, began to speak. So these verses establish that there were a whole series of memories that were crowding Arjuna's mind. Initially, his heart being disturbed, his mind completely, not situated as it was before. He was hardly able to enunciate what was going on in his mind. It was a grief that was too much. That was choking him up, that was causing him to shut down. But then, with difficulty, because Yudhishthira Maharaj had asked him this question, he forced himself to speak. And so overwhelmed, breathing very heavily, trying to control himself, he began to speak. And the first thing he says, text 5, he says, Arjuna Uvacha Vanchito ham Maharaja Harina Bandharupina Yena me paharitam tejo Deva Vishmapanam Mahat. Arjuna said, O king, the Supreme Personality of Godhead Hari, who treated me exactly like an intimate friend, Bandharupina, has left me alone. Vanchitoham. I'm just left all alone. I have been left completely like an abandoned child. I have no shelter anymore. I've lost my bearings without his presence. Has left me alone. Thus my astounding power, which astonished even the demigods, is no longer with me. So what was causing him distress was not the loss of his power, but the loss of his power allowed him to focus, or allowed him to enunciate how much to enunciate his natural inbred dependence upon Krishna, because Arjuna is an eternal associate of the Lord, and his mood of dependence towards Krishna is absolute. Now, the verses that come through from 6 through to 21, that section, Arjuna is going to remember each and every instance where he was able to show tremendous power and potential. These instances are actually very, very famous in the Mahabharata. And they stand out as exemplars that people would often regurgitate and remember whenever they would enunciate Arjuna's glories. And what Arjuna is going to state in these verses, what he's going to remember, is how his strength was dependent upon Krishna. So the loss of his strength, or Arjuna's inability to protect Krishna's wives, it is triggering remembrances of his relationship with Krishna, his dependence upon Krishna. And that is what he's going to state. Text 6. Yasya kshana viyogena loko hi apriyadharshana uktena rahito hi esha mritaka prochate yata. So mritaka prochate, it's like a dead body. That's how I'm feeling. I've just lost him whose separation for a moment would render all the universes unfavorable and void, like bodies without life. Here's the purport. Factually, for a living entity, there's no one dearer than the Lord. The Lord expands himself by innumerable parts and parcels as Swamsha and Vibhinamsha. Paramatma is the Swamsha part of the Lord, whereas the Vibhinamsha parts are the living beings. As a living being is the important factor in the material body. For without a living being, the material body has no value. Similarly, without Paramatma, the living being has no status quo. There is a question that is actually asked. This comes in, I believe, at the end of the 12th chapter of the 10th canto. But Parikshit Maharaj is actually genuinely surprised that actually at the end of maybe the 12th chapter, but Parikshit Maharaj is genuinely surprised that when Krishna had replaced all of the cows and cowherd boys with his own form, and he had become the sons and the calves of all of the elder gopis and of the cows in Vrindavan. Parikshit Maharaj was genuinely surprised that the affection of each of these elderly gopis and of the cows for their calves increased more than for their actual sons and calves. And Parikshit Maharaj asked, how is this possible? And Sukadev Goswami's question, his answer is very deep. He says that just as the body is dear because the soul is present, similarly the soul is dear because Krishna is present. The soul gets all its qualities, all its attributes, all its potential by Krishna's presence. And so whatever we like about someone, it actually comes from Krishna. So therefore, when one is in Krishna's presence directly, it is very, very natural to have more affection for him than for anybody else. And so Arjuna speaks here. He says, I have lost him whose separation for a moment would render all the universes unfavorable and void. For a devotee of Arjuna's caliber, no matter where he goes in the universe, he doesn't see the separate gardens or the mountains. He sees Krishna's beauty and potential. In fact, this was why in the 10th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, he asks Krishna to speak his opulences. Because what he wants to do is two things by asking that question in the 10th chapter. The first thing he wants to understand is, okay, if I am like a conditioned soul here, if I want to understand your personality, how do I do so? And he was asking for, when I look at trees, when I look at mountains, when I look at roses, how do I, from the things that I see, how can I understand you, your personality? And Krishna begins to speak about his opulences with the intention that if, for example, you see a rose and you see my potency in the rose, The quality of the rose, for example, of sweetness or tenderness, you can come to see me, you can come to experience a part of my actual quality and potency. If you see, for example, the power of a lion, by seeing the power of the lion, you can experience you by feeling wonder. Oh, wow! You look at the majesty of the lion, the speed with which it might run. Then you understand. Oh, this is a hint, if of Krishna's own majesty, superiority, and power. When you see the immovability of the Himalayan mountains, then you get a hint, because the Himalayan mountains are so vast and are the standard for a height that is difficult to scale. But you see that and you think, that level of immovability, that firmness, that Krishna is so unconquerable. It's a hint of Krishna's potency of being immovable or unconquerable. And so for a devotee like Arjuna, when he would see the world, he would be seeing Krishna's qualities. And the other reason Krishna asks to see his opulence is not just to understand from the things that he sees Krishna's qualities, but when he sees those objects, once he's already aware of Krishna's qualities, to get a trigger to remember his qualities. So one is for understanding, and the second is for continuous remembrance. But Arjuna took this to another level, because when he would be with Krishna, many times, even if they would go out for picnics, Krishna and Arjuna would disappear from the crowd, and because they would just want to be with each other. They would go on walks, they would go to secluded groves, and they would just be talking as friends. They would be sharing, because part of their relationship was to experience and taste the pleasure of combat. So they would each be regaling each other with the respective battles that they'd fought, the weapons they'd handled, like two warriors speaking to each other and relishing each other's experience and association. And sometimes when Krishna would say something that he had done that seemed like, wow, that's a very big thing, Arjuna would say, "My dear friend, you're very, very truthful today." He would be mildly, sarcastically, mild sarcasm. And he would be sarcastically telling Krishna that, I think what he's saying is an exaggeration. But the point is that Arjuna would go into such, areas, certain parts like groves or forests, etc., just to experience Krishna's association. And some of those groves and forests, many of them were around Hastinapur, where the Pandavas were staying. But all of these places were just completely void for Arjuna. Nothing made sense anymore. These were the places where he experienced the intimate exchange of affection with Krishna, and nothing there made sense anymore. None of those had any taste for him. So he says all the universe is unfavorable and void. Sometimes when, as parents, somebody loses a child, or one loses one's spouse, then the very places where one had the greatest, best experiences become the cause of pain. They become the cause of remembering intimately those very special moments that one had with that special someone in one's life. And that was what Arjuna was feeling now. Everything he was seeing was invoking in him remembrance of Krishna. And he was remembering how he had experienced Krishna's association everywhere. But with Krishna's absence, although he was experiencing Krishna's association more than in Krishna's direct presence, still he was experiencing that deep feeling of separation from Krishna's personal association. Text 7. Yat samshraya drupadageham upagatanam rajnam swayambara mukhe smaradhurmadhanam tejo hritam kalumaya pihitascha matsya sajji kritena dhanusadi cha Krishna. Only by his merciful strength was I able to vanquish all the lusty princes assembled at the palace of King Drupad for the selection of the bridegroom. With my bow and arrow, I could pierce the fish target and thereby taking the hand of Draupadi. Now he's having flashbacks, and he's going to focus on those specific instances where his power was dependent upon, where his success and power was manifested, but he experienced at that time Krishna's shelter and protection, and that's what he's remembering now. So this instance is very early on in the Pandavas' life. They had been banished from the kingdom because the Kauravas, including Duryodhana, had tried to kill the Pandavas, and the Pandavas had escaped and they were hiding somewhere. Now they'd heard about Draupadi's upcoming marriage, and so they, disguised as brahmanas, went to Draupadi, went to the Swayamvar, where they were hoping one of them could gain Draupadi's hand. She was reputed to be one of the most, or if not the most beautiful lady in those parts. Hearing about her beauty, the Pandavas were smitten and desired to go and obtain her hand. But present there, also desiring to obtain her hand, were amongst the greatest warriors in the world. Duryodhana, Karna, Jayadratha was also there. Jarasandha was also there. Amongst all of them, none of them was even able to pick up the bow except for Karna. Karna was able to pick up the bow, but he was disqualified for his lack of proper lineage. But Arjuna was able to, the task that was designed was with a special bow, looking at a pool of water at the ground. One had to pierce the eye of a fish that was revolving on a disc on the ceiling. The respective speeds of the fish revolving and its reflection in the water at the bottom were different. The speeds were different, and in addition, the fish was covered with like a cap with very, very small holes being present, just enough for an arrow to fit through. Now Arjuna had to look at the pool at the bottom and aim for the eye of the fish through only one of the holes above. And the person who was able to accomplish this feat with the disc and the reflection revolving at different speeds, so you could only look at the reflection, after lifting up and stringing this heavy bow, that person would be able to wed Draupadi. It was a feat that was designed to be accomplished only by Arjuna, because Draupadi's father Drupada wanted Draupadi to marry Arjuna. However, Arjuna here is remembering that I was only able to do this because of Krishna's mercy. My power, my ability at that time came from Krishna. And then after that, the kings were very agitated. How can a Brahmana do this? Oh, Draupadi, you have insulted us. How dare you set a task that nobody here can fulfill and then bestow your wife upon a Brahmana. If Brahmanas come to the Swayamvar of kings like this, then this could happen everywhere. And it would mean that you would create great instability amongst the ruling class, great instability amongst amongst society. So this should not be allowed. We should not allow Draupadi to get married. We should kill this king. We should burn Draupadi. They were speaking on these terms, and they were ready to attack. At that time, Bhima and Arjuna alone, the Pandavas had left, and it was Bhima and Arjuna alone against the kings of the world. And together, they were able to vanquish the kings. Particularly, Karna stood forward as the greatest archer amongst all of those warriors. And it was Shalya who was the strongest person there. So Shalya fought against Bhima, Karna fought against Karna fought against Arjuna. And when Shalya and Karna were both equaled and defeated, then the other kings were like, if these Brahmanas are capable of defeating Karna and Shalya, who are superlatively amongst the greatest warriors, who are the greatest warriors here, then we don't stand a chance. At that point, Krishna stepped in and said, look, Draupadi's been won fairly. Why don't we just call it quits and just leave it here? And the kings were too happy to agree. But Arjuna is remembering here that it was Krishna's potency alone that enabled this to happen. Text 8. Yitsannidavaham hukandavam agnayedam indram chasamaraganam tarasa vijitya labda sabamaya kritadbhuta shilpamaya digbyo haran ripatayo bhalimadvarete. Because he was near me, it was possible for me to conquer with great dexterity the powerful king of heaven, Indradev, along with his demigod associates, and thus enable the fire god to devastate the Khandava forest. And only by his grace was the demon named Maya saved from the blazing Khandava forest. And thus we could build our assembly house of wonderful architectural workmanship, where all the princes assembled during the performance of the Rajasuya Yajna and paid you tributes. So very shortly afterwards, this is a very famous incident. Krishna and Arjuna were relaxing in the forest and just spending time together. At that point, a Brahmana, who was actually the Agni Dev, who was the fire god disguised, he appeared before them and said, I beg for charity. They said, yes, whatever you want, we will give. We will try to give you if we have it. And then the Brahmana said, I desire, but I'm actually a very voracious eater. I'm not an ordinary Brahmana. They said, that's okay. You ask for what you want. We will give it to you. And he said, I want to devour the Khandava forest. They asked, who are you? He said that I am Agni. And my problem is that there is a particular king who has been performing yajnas continuously for 12 years. The amount of ghee that he has used has caused because generally when you put a lot of ghee into the stomach, for example, the fire of digestion becomes weak. So what Agni was saying was the amount of ghee that he has used has caused my potency to diminish. And Agni had actually gone to Brahma and asked what the solution for this was. And Brahma had told him that you have to go and devour the Khandava forest. The Khandava forest has certain medicinal herbs which will easily enable you to regain your potency. When Agni tried to devour the Khandava forest, Indra, who had a personal vested interest in protecting the Khandava forest because his personal friend stayed there, I don't remember who the friend was. Maybe it was Takshaka himself, who bid Parikshit Maharaj. But Takshaka was Indra's personal friend, or is Indra's personal friend. And so that snake was staying in the Khandava forest. So Indra had a personal vested interest in protecting the Khandava forest, and he prevented Agni from devouring the forest by releasing torrential rain. Agni was therefore frustrated, and he went back to Brahma, who told him, go to Krishna and Arjuna, they will help you. So Agni had come in the form of this Brahmana, begging for the charity of food. And when Krishna and Arjuna asked him what food he wanted, he said, I want the Khandava forest. So then Arjuna and Krishna prepared for battle, because they knew that if Indra is going to be trying to block Agni, if we fight against Indra, we're going to be fighting against the whole host of demigods. In addition, what was also going to happen was that the Khandava forest was the host to a whole horde of asuras and rakshasas. And they would also exit the forest prepared to defend or prepared to fight against Krishna and Arjuna, who were stopping the protection of the forest by Indra. So they prepared to fight. Krishna and Arjuna, so they actually they needed weapons. Arjuna said, look, we are prepared to fight with Indra, but I do not have a bow which is capable of withstanding the strength of my arms. At that point, Agni prayed to Varuna and gifted Arjuna his Gandiva bow. This is an instance that Prabhupada references in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. In addition, he had gifted him a chariot with 100 pure white horses. This is also referenced in the Bhagavad Gita. Mahati Syandane Sthito is the phrase used in the Bhagavad Gita. And he had gifted Arjuna also 2 inexhaustible quivers of arrows, armed with a chariot, with a Gandiva bow, and with these 2 quivers of arrows. Arjuna felt ready to combat the entire heavenly host. Now, to Krishna, he had gifted the Sudarshan Chakra. Now, for devotees, sometimes this narration can be a little bit confusing, because Sudarshan Chakra is also described as the Lord's eternal associate. But just as, for example, Rukmini was born as the daughter of King Bhishmaka, and he gifted Rukmini, or really Rukmini was stolen away, so that's a bad example. But you look at someone like Satyajit, who gifted Satyabhama to Krishna. See, Satyabhama is Krishna's eternal queen, and nobody can actually separate Satyabhama from Krishna at any time. Yet Satyabhama in those past times appeared as the daughter of King Satyajit, and Satyajit was given the opportunity of gifting the Lord his own eternal consort. Similarly, Agnidev was given the ability to gift Krishna the Sudarshan Chakra, who is Krishna's eternal associate and weapon. So Krishna was gifted the Sudarshan Chakra by Agni personally. Now, armed with these weapons, they're prepared to fight. And Krishna, with his Sudarshan Chakra, was taking care of all the Rakshasas and Asuras who were running out of the forest, including the Nagas, the serpents, who were coming to defend their forest. And Arjuna fought Indra and the entire host of demigods, all by himself. The weapons that were used were extraordinary. It was a battle the like of which had not been seen on earth for a very, very long time. And here the translation says, it was possible for me to conquer with great dexterity. He was fighting a host of the celestials. So it was necessary for him standing on a chariot, because he was fighting on the ground. They were attacking from the sky. He was revolving 360 degrees like this in all directions, looking up at the sky and combating assailants around. Other things that Indra did, apart from, there was a deluge of weapons. There was also a deluge of mountains. Indra, of course, he knew that Arjuna is his own son. And part of the reason that he used such force was he wanted to test Arjuna's power and experience that rasa with him. But some of the things that he did was to rip up entire mountains and hurl it at Arjuna. Arjuna, with his arrows alone, was able to break the mountains into just mud and sand and just have it cascade down harmlessly around. So therefore the phrase great dexterity is used, because Arjuna, that feat was truly remarkable. As an individual standing on lower ground to combat assailants 360 degrees with weapons, and who were hurling weapons and illusions and mountains, was a feat that was truly extraordinary. And this incident is referred to by others over and over again in describing why it was foolish of Duryodhana to challenge the Pandavas. They were saying, if Arjuna is capable of withstanding the entire celestial host, what makes you think, O Duryodhana, that you can combat Arjuna? And Duryodhana's faith was actually based on Bhishma, Drona, and Karna. Arjuna's remembering how it was Krishna's grace that enabled victory to take place. Text 9. Yatte jasan nipashiro angrim ahan makartam aryo nujastava gaja yuta sattva virya tena hrita pramatanata makaya bhupa yanmo chitastananayan bhalimadvarete. Your respected younger brother, who possesses the strength of 10,000 elephants, killed by his grace Jarasandha, whose feet were worshipped by many kings. These kings had been brought for sacrifice in Jarasandha's Mahabhairava Yajna. Mahabhairava is a form of Kali. But they were thus released. Later they paid tribute to your majesty. So, of course, it was Krishna's idea for the three of them, Arjuna, Bhima, and Krishna himself, to go disguised as Brahmanas into Jarasandha's kingdom and beg for the charity of a fight. This pastime is referenced in the Krishna book, or in the 10th canto of Bhagavatam. And it was Krishna who, when Bhima was trying to defeat Jarasandha but could not after 21 days of fighting, 21 or 23 days, maybe 21 days. And it was Krishna who told Bhima the secret of Jarasanda's birth. Because the name Jarasandha, Jara means, it's the name of a witch, Jara. Sandha means to join. So that person who was joined from two halves, he was joined by Jara, is called Jarasandha. The story of Jarasandha is interesting. His parents, he had a father who had two wives. So when the king he received a mango from a sage, saying that this mango will allow your wife to fall pregnant. He wanted to be equal to his two wives, so he gave them each half a mango. They both fell pregnant, and they both delivered one half of a child. The king, grief-stricken, he took those two halves and disposed them outside. A witch found those two halves and joined them together. That witch's name was Jara. So then he was called Jarasandha. Now the secret was not known to Bhima. And Krishna told him the secret of Jarasandha's birth. And he said, if you rip him apart from the middle, he will not be able to protect himself. So that's what Bhima had done. That's what caused his victory. Otherwise, Bhima, with all his strength, so the phrase used here is 10,000 elephants. The phrase 10,000 elephants is used as a standard measure for somebody who is very, very strong. So Bhima had that strength, Jarasandha had that strength, Dhritarashtra also had the strength. But all of them, but here, Bhima was able to defeat Jarasandha using Krishna's mercy. Now here's text 10. Patnyastavaadimaka klipta mahabhisheka slaghishta charu kabaram kitavai sabhayam sprishtam vikirya padayo patitashu mukhya yastat shriyo kritahate vimukta kesha. It was he only who loosened the hair of all the wives of the miscreants, who dared open the cluster of your queen's hair, which had been nicely dressed and sanctified for the great Rajasuya sacrificial ceremony. At that time, she fell down at the feet of Lord Krishna with tears in her eyes. Now, this incident is also very, very famous. It is referenced in different places. It's from a cultural point of view, a lady's hair is tied up. It is loosened, generally tied up. It is loosened only when their husband passes away. So that's why it is said it was he only who loosened the hairs of all the wives of the miscreants, because he caused the miscreants to die and he made the wives widows. So therefore they were forced to loosen their hair. And that was retribution for these miscreants opening Draupadi's hair. See, Draupadi was in her periods. And during the Rajasuya sacrifice, Draupadi's hair, which had been tied and decorated really nicely, was sanctified by the water from the yajna. This was considered to be one of the closing parts of the ceremony. Now, that sanctified hair, Dushasana dared to touch it under Duryodhana, Karna, and Shakuni's inspiration and Dhritarashtra's benevolence. And Dushasana dragged Draupadi by her hair into the assembly hall. And Krishna made sure that every single person who was involved, Dhritarashtra, of course, was not directly involved, but for those who were involved, Shakuni, Duryodhana, Karna, and so many others who allowed Dushasana, who allowed this to happen, who actually conducted this task, he made sure that they were killed and their wives were forced to become widows and loosen their hair also. Text 11. Yo no jugopavana etya duranta kritshrad durvasaso rishi rachitad ayutagra bhubhya sakana shishtam upayujya yatas triptam amamsta shalile vinimagna sangha. During our exile, Durvasa Muni, who eats with his 10,000 disciples, intrigued with our enemies to put us in dangerous trouble. At that time, he, Lord Krishna, simply by accepting the remnants of food, saved us. By accepting food thus, the assembly of Munis, while bathing in the river, felt sumptuously fed, and all the three worlds were also satisfied. See, this instance is another famous instance, which had occurred when the Pandavas were in the forest. They'd lost the gambling match. They were in the forest for their 14 years of exile. Now, 13 years or 14 years of exile. But at that time, Duryodhana, seeking to cause harm, had served Durvasa Muni very carefully. And when Durvasa was pleased by his service and asked Duryodhana, "What benediction do you want?" Duryodhana told him, "Please also wait upon my elder brother, Yudhishthir." Now, Duryodhana had a particular motivation in mind. Durvasa was known to be a very angry person if offended, and his curses were terrible. So Duryodhana was hoping that because Yudhishthir, if Yudhishthir could not serve Durvasa properly, then by facing Durvasa's curse, the Pandavas would be ruined and Duryodhana's work would be done. With this intention, Duryodhana asked for the benediction that Durvasa would wait upon Yudhishthir. So Durvasa went there, and Durvasa had been instructed to go when the Pandavas had finished their meal, and Draupadi had also finished the meal. Because see, Draupadi had received from the sun god like a vessel. This is known as the Akshaya Patra, or the unlimited vessel. Any item that was put inside would multiply unlimitedly as long as Draupadi herself had not eaten. So generally, the Pandavas would cook. Draupadi would cook. She would offer it to the Supreme Lord. Then she would use this vessel to serve every item to the Brahmanas, serve her husbands, and then she would partake of a meal. Once she took her meal, for the rest of the day, the Akshaya Patra would not function. But when Durvasa went there after Draupadi had taken prasadam, the Pandavas had no means by which they could satisfy Durvasa and these 10,000 disciples. So at that point, Draupadi was like completely panicking along with the Pandavas because they knew what Durvasa's curse was like. But Draupadi's natural reaction was to remember Krishna, because in distress or otherwise, a devotee's natural reaction is to remember Krishna. With great feeling, Draupadi was remembering Krishna, who was at that time with Rukmini. Instantly, he disappeared from Rukmini's side and appeared at Draupadi's side. And he asked her, "What is the problem?" She explained the situation. And Krishna, he surprised her. He said, "I'm very hungry. Please give me something to eat." And Draupadi was thinking, "Oh, Prasad, what great fortune and misfortune. The Lord of the three worlds, the enjoyer of all sacrifices, is personally asking me to feed him. I would love to feed him, but I have nothing to feed anybody." And she began to cry. But then Krishna said, no, don't cry. Just go get me the vessel. There may be some little bit there, which you may not have washed properly. Draupadi hurried inside. She brought the vessel to him. She had cleaned it out thoroughly. But sometimes in some depictions of this pastime, they show Krishna manifesting a small grain. Or some people say that perhaps, it had not been washed properly. In either case, there was a small bit of grain, just like a tiny bit of grain left in one corner. And Krishna took it and he ate it. And he said, "May the whole world be satisfied." So this is an illustration also. This pastime is used to illustrate how if Krishna is satisfied, everyone is satisfied. Just as if the stomach is filled, the entire body is energized. Or if the root is watered, then the tree and every branch, every leaf is nourished. Similarly, when Krishna was satisfied with that offering of small grain of rice cooked by his devotee, then Durvasa and his 10,000 disciples, of course the whole world, but Durvasa and the 10,000 disciples, they felt like they'd eaten a heavy meal. Bhima was sent by Krishna. Krishna then, after he ate that morsel of rice and he said, "May the whole world be satisfied," he sent Bhima. He said, "Go and call Durvasa here for prasadam." Of course, there was no prasadam at all. But the Pandavas had so much faith in Krishna that without hesitation, question, Bhima just went there. And he said, "My dear sirs, prasadam is ready, please come." Durvasa was like petrified, because when he felt his stomach like so full, he was like, "I can't eat another morsel. I will explode." And then he said, I don't know why I'm feeling so full, but I know what the consequences are of offending a devotee, because he had already offended Ambarish once before. And he said, these devotees of the Lord, they're extremely powerful. And if I go there and I do not eat the feast that Yudhishthira has undoubtedly prepared, then I will offend him. And the consequence of offending him will be terrible. So he told his disciples, let's just run from here. When Bhima called them, and then he just went away, just giving them time to come out and dress themselves and come at leisure. Durvasa and all his disciples, they just ran away. And they never appeared at the Pandavas' doorstep. So Krishna had protected the Pandavas then also. In these purports, which we're not reading, Prabhupada narrates these pastimes, incidences. Text 12. Yatejasasta Bhagavan Yudhishula Panir Vishma Pita Sajirigo Stram Adhani Jamme Anye Pichahamamunai Vakalevarena Prapto Mahendra Bhavane Mahad Asanardham. Now, this reference to Lord Shiva is a particular instance where, when the Pandavas were in the forest, Arjuna was instructed to seek celestial weapons, which would be useful in the final combat. So at that point, he was sitting in the forest and he was worshipping Shiva. Actually, he worshipped Indra, who came before him and told him, worship Shiva, then you will get all the weapons from all the demigods. At that point, he began to worship Shiva, and he did that for about a year. After worshipping Shiva, suddenly the environment that he was in, which was mountainside, it changed and became like a spring-type environment full of beautiful flowers. And a hunter and his wife appeared there. This was Shiva and Parvati in disguise, because Shiva wanted to test Arjuna's ability in combat. And over a trivial matter, there was a boar running, a Rakshasa actually was coming to kill Arjuna. Both Arjuna and the hunter strung their bows and instantly killed arrows. In fact, both the arrows shot the boar at the same time. But amongst warriors or hunters, it is considered to be bad etiquette to shoot at a target that someone else is shooting at. So over a small thing, Shiva raised a dispute. You have shot at my boar, so therefore I should kill you, according to the etiquette, for your breach of etiquette. And Arjuna said, what nonsense are you saying? It was my arrow that killed the boar. Your arrow struck it afterwards. I should kill you for your words. And like this, a fight broke out. They fought against each other. Now, Arjuna actually lost, but Shiva was astonished at Arjuna's power, and he told him that your power is almost equal to mine. And he considered Arjuna to be worthy of obtaining Shiva's personal weapon. Every demigod has a personal weapon. Like Krishna has the Sudarshan Chakra, that's his personal weapon. Lord Shiva has his personal weapon, which is the Pashupati Astra. This was actually used by Arjuna in his fight with the demons Nivata Kavachas, which is referenced in a later verse. But the Pashupata Astra was personally given by Shiva. And after Lord Shiva granted him this weapon, all the other demigods, then Lord Shiva disappeared. Then the four main demigods, Indra, Kuvera, these are known as the Lokapalas, the protectors of the worlds. Indra, Kuvera, Varuna, and Yama, they each appeared, and they each granted Arjuna their personal weapon. So Indra gave Arjuna his Vajra, his thunderbolt, which is his personal weapon. Yama gave his noose, and Varuna gave his ropes, and Yama gave his noose, I believe, or his mace, I forget. And Kuvera gave his Antardhana weapon, which is a weapon that allows you to disappear and fight from different locations very quickly. But each of them had given Arjuna their personal weapons, and so that's what's also referenced here. And Indra honored Arjuna and allowed him to share his throne. So the king of heaven has his own throne. So when the translation says he was allowed a half elevated seat, it was Indra's seat, and Indra was sitting on one half, Arjuna was sitting on the other half. So Arjuna was honored equally with the king of heaven, which is an extraordinary distinction offered to a mortal. And Arjuna is remembering that this all happened by Krishna's potency and mercy. All of this that is being narrated are actually Arjuna's glories. Anybody who would speak about Arjuna's glories would reference all these instances. But Arjuna's pointing out that each of these things were by Krishna alone. Text 13. Tatraiva me viharato bhujadanda yugmam Ghandiva lakshana marati vadhaya deva Sendra shrita yadanubhavitam ajamidha Tena hamadhya mushita purushena bhumna. When I stayed for some time as a guest in the heavenly planets, all the heavenly demigods, including King Indradeva, took shelter of my arms, which were marked with the Gandiva bow, to kill the demon named Nivatakavacha. O king, descendant of Ajamida, at the present moment, I am bereft of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, by whose influence I was so powerful. So this, after receiving the weapons of each of the demigods, actually, at the time that Indra appeared, he told him, I will give you my personal weapon and all the weapons that I have in my possession, but come and stay with me and spend some time learning from me. So Arjuna was taken in Indra's personal chariot to his planet, where he spent some time and mastered all the celestial weapons under Indra's command. And mastering all those celestial weapons, Indra then he gave him what do you call it, like a tiara, a crown. Therefore, Arjuna's name became Kirita. This Kirita was destroyed in his final battle with Karna, or his penultimate battle with Karna, actually. And then Indra asked him for a Guru Dakshina of destroying the demons called the Nivata Kavachas, who were protected from Indra. So here Arjuna says, depending on the strength of my arms, I embarked to fight the Nivata Kavachas. Now the Nivata Kavachas were very fierce and powerful warriors. This fight is narrated in the Mahabharata, and it's an extraordinary fight. Ultimately, Arjuna was able to win by using Shiva's Pashupati Astra, and he destroyed all of them. But he's saying that I was only able to conduct that fight in that way because of Krishna's potency. Text 14. Yad bhandava kurubhalabdim hananta param eko ratena tatareham atirya sattvam pratyahritam bahudanam cha maya paresham tejas padam manimayam charitam shirobhya. The military strength of the Kauravas was like an ocean in which there dwelt many invisible existences, and thus it was insurmountable. But because of his friendship, I, seated on a chariot, was able to cross over it. And only by his grace was I able to regain the cows and also collect by force many helmets of the kings which were bedecked with jewels that were sources of all brilliance. So this was towards the very, very end of their exile. Exile had actually technically finished. But the Kauravas had come to know that the Pandavas might be in Virata's kingdom. They attacked. At that point, Arjuna alone faced the entire Kaurava army. And this is again a very famous incident narrated in the Mahabharata. He was able to, by alone, single-handedly stand and defeat Bhishma, Drona, Karna, Duryodhana, Shakuni, Ashwatthama, among the greatest warriors on the planet. Drona, I mentioned. So everybody who was great, he was able to defeat them at that time alone. And this was an extraordinary feat. And he used the Mohana Astra, the Mohana weapon, to cause all of them to fall asleep in the end. And he humiliated them by collecting their crowns and their cloths, like their upper cloth, which were very, very valuable. Each of them were bedecked with many, many jewels and were a symbol of great prestige and status. He took their upper cloth and their crown, and he took it back to Uttara, who was his student, danced. She was the princess, the daughter of King Virata, in whose kingdom the Pandavas were sheltered. And Arjuna was a teacher. When he was leaving, she had told him, when the Kauravas are defeated, please bring me back their upper cloths for my dolls. So remembering that promise, he took their helmets and their upper cloth so that Uttara could decorate her dolls with them. But Arjuna was able to accomplish this only by Krishna's potency. Now, text 15 onwards, Arjuna will speak further instances related to his prowess on the battlefield. But the principle is the same. Each of these instances, they are very, very, very famous instances in the Mahabharata. In fact, the instances that are stated here are the most exciting parts of Mahabharata. And people read them over and over and over again. And Arjuna's like the main protagonist that you keep vouching for in the Mahabharata. You want him to win. You want people to hear. You want to hear people say that there's nobody as great as Arjuna. In fact, it is said that the Mahabharata is, in some sense, a glorification of Arjuna's power, Arjuna's abilities, Arjuna's prowess. But what Arjuna is pointing out, this was his internal experience, that each one of those instances were really a function of Krishna's grace. And this is what he's remembering now when his own power is taken away. He's not concerned about the loss of his power, but the loss of his power is allowing him to remember the dependency he has on Krishna. And just recollecting in one of the earlier verses of this chapter, it was described that Arjuna's mind was disturbed. This is in text 1 of this chapter. After speaking all of this, when Yudhishthira himself expressed grief, at that point, Arjuna began to remember Krishna's instructions in the very beginning of the Kurukshetra war, of course, the Bhagavad Gita. And our acharyas say that Arjuna remembered Krishna's promise at the end of the Bhagavad Gita. Manmanabhava madbhakto madhyaji mam namaskuru. Mam e vaishyasi satyam te pratijani priyosime. He remembered because Krishna had left him and gone. And he was thinking, how can I be with Krishna again? He needed something to feel pacified. And he remembered Krishna telling him that if you constantly worship me through the 9 processes of bhakti in pure devotional service, desiring only a relationship with me, that standard of worship, I promise you, Arjuna, you will come to me, for you are my very dear friend. Remembering that promise that he could be with Krishna very soon, his mind became peaceful and pacified. Because through that instruction, he was able to experience Krishna's presence and able to understand how he could connect with Krishna now and later. We are also separated from Krishna. And although we do not have these acute feelings and remembrances of our relationship with Krishna that Arjuna has, nonetheless, these feelings are the ultimate goal that we are aiming for. Following Arjuna's footsteps and remembering Krishna's instructions in the Bhagavad Gita, sometimes my experience has been that I, and sometimes I've seen others, Bhagavad Gita is taken far too lightly. The instructions there, each and every single verse is capable of giving prema bhakti, and each and every verse is capable of invoking remembrance of Krishna. Of course, Bhagavatam also. But Arjuna remembered Krishna's promise in the Bhagavad Gita, and he remembered Krishna's instructions, and that allowed him to experience Krishna's presence. So the study of Srimad Bhagavatam and the study of the Bhagavad Gita, even in our situation now when we're separated from Krishna, of course, our feelings for him are not acute, but we will develop those feelings for Krishna. And in our separation, we will be able to experience his presence and want to be with him. That is the power of Krishna's instructions. And that is the lesson that Arjuna shows us through these verses and these pastimes. The one other point that I just wish to mention that I neglected to emphasize in the beginning, and I think this comes in verse number 3 or 4, this comes in text number 4. Arjuna uses 3 terms to describe his relationship with Krishna in text 4. He uses the words Sakyam, Maitrim, and Sauhridam. Sakyam refers to an equal exchange between friends. Maitrim means friendship with the mood of servitorship. And Sahrida means friendship with a sense of paternal affection with a mixture of Vatsalya. And Arjuna, of course, had all of these things, because sometimes as a friend, you feel like serving and assisting the person. Sometimes as a friend, you feel like protecting the other individual. So there's a blend of emotions and experiences. But the principal relationship that Arjuna had was, of course, Sakya. So Sakyam, Maitrim, Sauridam. These were the categories of experiences that Arjuna had with Krishna. In these verses, he's experiencing, of course, there are some instances which deal with equal exchanges. There are some exchanges where he identifies more in the mode of servitorship. And there are some instances where he expresses paternal type affection. But in either case, these remembrances are very, very prominent. And just like pictures, he's taken back to the experiences of all those impressions and those moments that he had with the Lord. And the conclusion that he reaches is remembering Krishna's instructions. You just hear and chant my name. You become my devotee. Worship me. Think of me. You will come to me. That was the ultimate conclusion that all of these remembrances led him to. Remembering that instruction and devoting his mind and attention to Krishna's lotus feet. Arjuna and the Pandavas wound up their pastimes and returned to join Krishna in his eternal pastimes. Because when the Pandavas came to this world, sometimes it is said that the Pandavas are expansions of the demigods. Sometimes it is said the Pandavas are the eternal associates of the Lord. What actually happened was that the Pandavas are eternal associates of the Lord. When they appeared, the expansions of the demigods merged into the body of the Pandavas. So when Krishna left, the Pandavas also left the kingdom. This comes in the end of the 15th chapter of the first canto. They also left the kingdom. The Mahabharata details that the Pandavas walked up the Himalayas one by one. They fell, and then finally Yudhishthira went in his body to the heavenly planets. But the Bhagavatam states that the Pandavas, they just left and they joined Krishna's eternal pastimes. They're both correct, because what happened was that when the Pandavas left the kingdom, the expansions of the demigods who had merged into the Pandavas' bodies, they separated themselves and they walked up the hills to go back to heaven. But the Pandavas, who were the eternal associates of the Lord, the original Pandavas, so to speak, they just left in their spiritual bodies to join where Krishna would go next to manifest and assist his pastimes once again. So we will end here. Sorry, the intention was to cover this up to verse 21. That did not happen. But these verses are really deep, and much more than speaking about them, it is more important to just chant them, remember and read those instances from Prabhupada's purports and the Mahabharata, and understand the deep mood of dependence and separation that Arjuna was experiencing at the time. And to constantly remember reading these verses that Arjuna, the conclusion that Arjuna reached was that by hearing and chanting about him now, I can completely experience Krishna's presence even in separation and go to him personally to serve him again in the future. As a last note, not only are we separated from Krishna, sometimes we're also, most of the time, we're separated from our spiritual master also. And when our spiritual master leaves this world, the experience is similar. Srila Prabhupada's disciples remembered Srila Prabhupada's pastimes throughout their presence, throughout their association with him. And when he left, it was hard for them to bear his separation. But Srila Prabhupada's promise, you just follow the process that I've given you, and you will go back home, back to Godhead. We will have an ISKCON in the spiritual world. We will all serve together, is what keeps them, many of them, sustained. This was something that His Holiness Bhakti Charu Maharaj remembered his whole life. In fact, many of Srila Prabhupada's disciples remember this, and they just, in their Vyas Puja offerings or in their personal prayers, their mood is, Prabhupada, please, may we join you again. Remembering Srila Prabhupada's instructions, remembering his statements, they serve him in separation, and his Prabhupada's instructions allow them to experience Prabhupada's presence completely here and give them the assurance that they will join him again soon. We can also follow Prabhupada's instructions from that point of view, and more personally have that relationship with our own spiritual master. He may be separated from us in the sense of a different location in this world, or increasingly many of our spiritual masters are leaving this world. If not now, 10, 15, 20 years, most of the senior Vaishnavas present, Krishna willing, they stay as long as possible, but at some point it will happen. But we are assured of being able to join them again by following this mood, and we can experience everything that Archana is experiencing here. If we cultivate that deep relationship with our spiritual master now, and continue that relationship in separation when he is not present. Her Grace Yamuna Mataji, she, after Prabhupada left, she approached His Holiness Giriraj Swami, and the first question she asked him was, how has your relationship with Srila Prabhupada developed since he has left? Because that was her mood. That had been her mood of service for the 30-odd years at the time that she had been cultivating Krishna consciousness after Prabhupada left. And Giriraj Maharaj says that one question of Yamuna Mataji took me 9 hours to answer her properly. But this is the mood that the great devotees, that the senior devotees are cultivating. And it is a mood that is not just theoretically expressed by Arjuna, but can be practically applied and experienced by us also. Sorry I've taken more time, but I hope that we could all relish this together. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande, Hari Hari Bol, Hare Krishna.